How did the British morally dislocate some of their own troops, and what was the effect on morale? This is episode 12 of the Principles of War podcast, Morale in the Malaya Campaign. So in this episode, we're going to look at the contrast of morale between the Allies and the Japanese as they fought their way down the Malayan Peninsula. This is the last of the 10 principles, and in some respects, it's probably the most important because it really does highlight a lot of the issues that the Allies had as they were trying to stop the Japanese army. So before we kick off, let's have a quick look at the definition of maintenance of morale. So morale is an essential element of combat power. High morale engenders courage, energy, cohesion, endurance, steadfastness, determination, and a bold offensive spirit. In any given situation, military success may depend as much on morale as on material advantages. Good leadership, thorough training, and success on operations will all contribute to high morale. Actions taken directly or indirectly to destroy the enemy's morale are an important means of reducing the enemy's combat effectiveness. So that's quite a mouthful there. So what I want to do is to break it down into some of the important components of it. Now, the first one is good leadership, thorough training, and success on operations will all contribute to high morale. So, good leadership. We start off with, sort of looking at battalion commander level. You've got Lieutenant Colonel Stewart of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, probably one of the best battalion COs in Malaya. Well led, and they fought really well. Same with some of the Australian battalions, quite well led and actually quite effective. But the same can't be said for a lot of the other units that were fighting in Malaya on the Allied side. Thorough training, some of them didn't have much training at all. Even the units that had been in Malaya, that had been stationed there before the war, had done very little training, and they'd done very little training in the jungle. So they may have done training, but it wasn't specific to the kind of terrain that they were going to be fighting in. And of course, the 8th Division soldiers, they'd been training for the desert. And some of them had been there for a while, so some of them did get that jungle training, but there were definitely varying degrees of familiarity with the jungle. And success on operations. Now, from the Allies' point of view, this was their first operation, so they didn't have any successes to their name. A lot of these formations were the result of the rapid expansion of Allied armies as they answered the call of Britain as it started spinning up for a global war. So definitely a lot of the Indian troops were quite new. And same for the Australian 8th Division. This was the 3rd Division that had been formed out of the nucleus of the CMF. Now, compare and contrast that with the Japanese. So, quite effective leadership at all levels. Thorough training. They'd had 10 exercises to not only work out the doctrine for fighting in Malaya and conducting the amphibious assaults, but also a significant amount of operational experience. So the Guards Division, that wasn't newly formed, but was considered elite, although it hadn't had any operational experience. All of the other divisions had had operational experience in China. So highly experienced, well-led troops. Now, why is morale important? So, as per the definition, high morale engenders courage, energy, cohesion, endurance, steadfastness, determination, and a bold offensive spirit. In general, that is the description of the way that the IGA fought. Courageous, with energy, cohesive, significant endurance. They were steadfast, determined, bold, and really embodied that offensive spirit. The flip side of that is it definitely describes a lot of the Allied troops. Not all of them, and not all of them at all occasions, but definitely significant numbers of troops in the actions that they were in did not fight well. They lacked courage, endurance, determination, and definitely lacked an offensive spirit. Now, not all the time. The Battle of Kampar is an excellent example of where the Indian troops fought very well They fought a static defence, inflicted significant casualties on the Japanese. They held up the advance for 4 days, and they only withdrew, and they withdrew in good order, which is important to remember because that didn't always happen. They withdrew in good order only when they were outflanked by an amphibious move by the Japanese. Now, Kampar occurred on between the 30th of December and the 2nd of January, so fairly early in the campaign. Actions taken directly or indirectly to destroy the enemy's morale are an important means of reducing the enemy's combat effectiveness. Kampar, I think, was the high point for the morale of the defenders, because it comes after the Battle of Jitra, and this is the last well-managed large-scale defensive action conducted by the Allies. From here, the Japanese are able to take back the initiative that they had temporarily lost and increase the operational tempo on the Allies and increase the pressure, which gets to the point where it is unsustainable for the Allies to maintain a cohesive defence. So what was it that caused the Allied morale to be eroded so quickly? And there's a couple of elements of this. So first off is that they're conducting the withdrawal. And the withdrawal that saps away at morale at the best of times because you are trading ground. Armies like to be fed on a diet of victories, and to say that you have withdrawn in good order, that's not the best of victories. You might have carried out your mission, but that's not the kind of mission that is going to fundamentally underpin strong morale generally. And the fact of it was that a lot of these withdrawals weren't conducted in good order. They were quite shambolic at times. Why was that? And that is because of the way that the Japanese were fighting. So they would come up, attempt a filleting attack. If that didn't work, then they would fight for the road, off the road, by fighting around, looking for the flanks, and then threatening the roads which the Allies were tied to for their withdrawal. So they would threaten the withdrawal routes, put strong forces there, so that the withdrawal often had to be conducted in contact, not only in contact with the forces that were at the front, but also in contact as you were trying to move down the road on your withdrawal route. And this was undermining the morale because the withdrawals weren't being conducted in good order. Now, let's look at the training that had been conducted prior to this. And we've already talked when we were looking at cooperation. There wasn't very good cooperation between the infantry and the artillery. There was no armoured support. There was very little training in combined arms, which meant that when tanks were encountered for the first time, it was not handled well, and the tanks were often able to conduct these incredibly destructive filleting attacks where they would just roll straight through a defensive position and then into the rear areas which weren't prepared for combat, let alone prepared for tanks, and they would wreak carnage on the defensive forces. Now, there were pamphlets in Singapore on how to deal with the tank threat. They weren't actually distributed until after the invasion had commenced, and by then they were in an operational environment. They were no longer in a training environment, and there was little time to put the lessons that were contained in those pamphlets into practice. We've talked about why there was little defensive work that had been completed, and one of the reasons was that it was bad for morale to be seeing people to be digging in and placing anti-tank obstacles. Well, I've got to tell you, I think it's a lot worse for morale being defeated because you haven't done the defensive works that you needed to be able to conduct a decent withdrawal. That's where the morale is significantly eroded, not by people walking by and seeing troops digging in or anti-tank obstacles being placed. That wasn't the best of decisions. There was also this thinking that the withdrawal actually was bad for morale as well. So Bennett didn't rehearse withdrawals at all because he thought that was bad for morale. He didn't like people digging in. He thought that was bad for morale. And you know what? It probably is bad for morale. The troops are going to grumble because they have to dig in. but they're not going to grumble anywhere near as much as they will grumble once they start receiving artillery or bombing from the Japanese Air Force. That is significantly worse. The one thing that you want when you're being shelled is somewhere safe that you can lie and be as close to the ground as you possibly can be. So some of the preparation, some of the thinking was quite defective when it came to the maintenance of morale for the troops. Now, one of the elements that leads to high morale is good leadership, or if not great leadership. And it's interesting when you look at it from Malaya Command down, there was conflicts within headquarters, there were conflicts between headquarters, and this created friction. What was needed was some good leaders, some great leaders, to show great leadership and to iron out all of this conflict. The ability to be a team player, whether you're a staff officer, whether you're a brigade commander, a battalion commander, I think that's really fundamental in creating harmonious relationships, because what happened here is that these conflicts, and where you've got people who aren't even on speaking terms anymore because their interpersonal relationship have degraded so much, it creates a significant amount of friction. And friction is something that you want to avoid wherever possible, because there's going to be plenty of friction just moving troops, just supplying troops, just knowing what's going on in the AO. They are difficult things to do, and there's a lot of friction inherent with those moves. We haven't even talked about what the enemy's doing to increase the amount of friction. So when you've got headquarters that aren't functioning well, this creates a significant problem. It expands the amount of time that's required to make decisions. And this meant that the Japanese had the ability to bedazzle command decision making. So a lot of the decisions took too long to be made, and by the time they were actually got to the troops who had to enact them, they had become meaningless. And this is, once again, this is that turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which the enemy cannot cope. And the sad thing is that a lot of this was because of the personal relationships at the higher levels in the command structure. So when a unit has been surrounded, their ability to withdraw, or their withdrawal route has been cut off, what should happen? What should have the SOP been? Well, it's quite easy. You stay and fight. You should have cached food, ammunition. You should be able to stay in position and block the Japanese where they are, defend the location that you're in. What then happens is that the flanking forces will come to your aid. So either the reserve will be called forward, and then they're able to smash the force that is holding your withdrawal route, and then you can conduct an orderly withdrawal, or forces to the left or right of you will come in and assault the Japanese who are trying to contain your position. Now, you require trust and cooperation to be able to do that. And neither of these were in great supply with the Allies in Malaya. Now, why would this have worked? Simply because the Japanese were paying off a lot of the principles of war. Now, you can pay off a principle of war when no one's going to call you on it. And this is what was happening. The Allies weren't calling them on it. If they had stayed in place, they would have been able to exploit the lack of sustainment in the Japanese troops. So those troops who were going through the jungle to conduct a roadblock on your withdrawal route, they're not going to be well supplied. If you are surrounded, then they're going to have difficulty in the number of troops that they've got to provide all-round protection, to provide security. The issue was that far too infrequently were the Japanese being called on this. They were allowed to get away with it. This was the opportunities that the Allies had, and this was the opportunities that they never really took up. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders on a couple of occasions made them pay the penalty, and the Australian troops in a couple of areas. And obviously the number one example of this would be in the ambush at Gamass, where there was no security whatsoever, bicycle troops moving forward without any recon, and they were made to pay the price for that. But these were fleeting examples that were far too infrequently repeated throughout the AO. These defeats, these troops being cut off, battalions, brigades having their withdrawal routes severed and being left to fend for themselves, this created a perception in Allied commanders' minds. And they started giving up strongly defended locations without a fight. If the enemy commander believes that he is beaten, then his entire force is beaten. And this is why you want to be fighting a battle inside the enemy commander's head at whatever level it is that you're fighting. Because if you can get him to believe that he's beaten, then you're 90% of the way there. And this was often what was happening. Well, the withdrawal routes are threatened. We need to leave, and we need to leave now because otherwise it's going to be another rout. This became like a cancer within the thinking of all of the Allied forces, and a very strong save yourself mentality pervaded. That became the norm in the final days of the retreat to Singapore. Now, another thing that's really important is in the decay of the morale of the troops was when the in order to of your orders is no longer relevant. So a lot of the time, troops were positioned to defend air bases. And because there was such little cooperation between the Army and the Air Force, it often meant that troops were left in a position where they were defending an airbase that had already been abandoned. And an excellent example of that is the Kuantan Air Base. And that was abandoned without any destroying of any of the equipment or the supplies, and the enemy was still 290 kilometres north. So the RAF were quite quick in getting out from that base, but the troops were left there to defend the area. And so the big issue here was that it was on ground that was not chosen for its defensive qualities. So the poor troops have got crappy ground to defend, and they're defending it for an airbase which has already been abandoned. That makes you much less likely to stand and fight when the reason that you're there to fight is no longer valid. Now, it's probably worthwhile having a bit of a look at moral dislocation. So, moral dislocation seeks to accelerate the enemy's culmination by breaking his will and convincing him that further resistance is futile. The enemy no longer has the desire to continue the struggle, and he capitulates. Now, I'm reading from a paper, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes, talking about dislocation in general, and I'm looking at the moral dislocation component of it. And it says a combination of rapid manoeuvre that imbalances the enemy, information superiority that denies the enemy knowledge of friendly plans while simultaneously exploiting the enemy's plans, and tempo that denies the enemy the time to react accelerates culmination. Now, this is not a new idea. Liddell Hart wrote about it, and he said psychological dislocation fundamentally springs from the sense of being trapped. That would sound familiar to the troops in Malaya. But going back even further, Clausewitz concluded that material and moral elements are woven together, but difficult to predict. Increases and decreases in the moral domain can be felt, but they can't be classified. So using the moral dislocation of the enemy to shape the battlefield requires the commander to understand the key components that strengthen the moral domain and how to use that knowledge to accelerate the enemy's moral collapse. All right, so, and really what we're talking about here is the classical maneuverist moral dislocation, in that as soon as we're in contact, it's probably going to go badly. We're going to lose. We're all going to die, and I'm not prepared to die here now, so I'm going to withdraw. That's the moral dislocation that they're talking about. But I think that there's a little bit more art to what the Japanese were doing to achieve their moral dislocation, and that was aimed squarely at the Indian units. So they were attempting to morally dislocate the Indians. Now, one definition that's important is moral dislocation causes the enemy strength to be irrelevant due to the unwillingness of his soldiers or leaders to fight. And that's from Robert Leonard in his book, The Principles of War for the Information Age. We're talking before the information age, well, before the electronic information age. So how did the Japanese seek to morally dislocate the Indian forces? And right at the start of this podcast, this is what I was talking about, how the British Army were shaping themselves to be morally dislocated. So the Japanese were trying to create the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. And the meme for this, if they had memes back then, was Asia for the Asiatics. In the booklet that we talked about, Read This and the War is Won, it presented colonialism as an oppressive group of colonists living in luxury by burdening Asians. Since racial ties of blood connected other Asians to the Japanese and Asians had been weakened by colonialism, it was Japan's self-appointed role to make men of them again and to liberate them from their Western oppressors. They were coming as liberators of the Indians. So, now, why was it that the Indians felt that they needed to be liberated? Because you're only going to feel the need for liberation when you're being oppressed. How were the Indian people in Malaya being oppressed? And there's a couple of things that the British were doing that made them feel this way. They weren't paying Indian workers, the Indian coolies, they weren't paying them the same rates that other coolies were getting paid. And we talked a little about this in the Sustainment podcast. But this created a schism between the Indians, and this is where they were starting to feel, because it wasn't a lot of money at all, and the Indian government was stopping sending out coolies out to Malaya because of the fact that they were being treated so badly. Now, not only this, but there were multiple strikes. So because the wage conditions were so poor, there was quite a lot of unionism and communism as well. Now, obviously, this is a significant threat to the government of the day, and so they would use the police to put down these strikes. Sometimes the police weren't able to put down the strikes, so they would then call out the army. Now, the units that they were calling out were Indians, so you had Indian soldiers firing on Indian striking workers. This created significant problems for the British because obviously the Indian troops were not happy with this role at all. The Malays as well were treated quite badly, and they were just treated as a source of labour by the British. So the British are doing pretty much everything that they can to upset the local inhabitants of Malaya. And I think there's one really interesting example that I can give that really highlights, I think, the opportunity for moral dislocation of the Indian troops. And that is that one of the units they had some leave, and some of the officers went out and they were invited to a club that had a pool. Now, that club, and so they were all going to go swimming. You know, it's hot in Malaya. It would be, that's a nice sort of, afternoon thing to do. Let's all go down to the pool. We can relax, have a few drinks. That sounds like a good thing to do. This is obviously pre-invasion. So some officers from one of the Indian brigades go to this club. Now, there's a problem. There are British officers there and Indian officers. The Indian officers aren't able to swim in the pool because it's a whites-only pool. Now, I don't want to look at this with today's eyes. I don't want to look at it with today's eyes, and because obviously that's morally abhorrent and, that is fundamentally wrong. What I want to do, though, is try and look at it from the Indian officer's point of view, because this clearly draws a line between the Indian officers and the British officers, the have-nots and the haves. And I think that you're much less likely to work as hard as you can, to be courageous, to be determined. You're not going to do any of those things if you're fighting a war on behalf of other people to maintain their rights to things that you don't have access to. The Japanese were aiming to exploit this. Now, this is just one example, but the problem is that it was replicated in many different ways at many different times. And you go into what happened in Penang. So Penang's an island off Malaya, and it was bombed daily by the Japanese for between the 8th of December and the 17th of December. And it was decided to withdraw from Penang because it was strategically of no value whatsoever. Now, once again, of course, lots of supplies were left. There were boats, weapons, a radio station. All of these things were left for the Japanese, which is very kind of the British to be aiding the enemy like that. But the big issue with Penang is that they only evacuated Europeans. The local inhabitants were left to the mercy of the Japanese. And this created much embarrassment for the British, and it really alienated the local population. We don't really care about you enough to evacuate you, so sorry, that just doesn't cut it. And there's a lot of people who think that the moral collapse of British rule in Southeast Asia didn't come in Singapore, but at Penang, because that was the bit that really underlined the fact that A, the British were colonial rulers, and B, they didn't really have that much power anymore. So firstly, you've got this perception of power, and you'll put up with colonialism if you're oppressed, if the oppressors is very powerful. Now, this was falling apart for the British because the Japanese were advancing relentlessly, so the perception of the power that they have is rapidly diminishing, and it's not we're here to help build Malaya for the Malays and, we're building a fantastic country here. It's no, we're here to take all of the resources and we don't really care about any of the people here. This is what their actions were saying, and this is what the Japanese were aiming to exploit. And it worked really well for them. So the Japanese troops were often warned of Allied positions by the Malays. Now, the next part in the moral collapse of the Allied forces is just the operational tempo was so high. Now, and the thing that's really interesting about this, you've got to remember the force ratios that we've got in play here. So the Japanese are significantly outnumbered. So the attacking force is outnumbered by the defenders. That's not quite right. But even then, even though they were so badly outnumbered, the Japanese were able to generate an operational tempo that was significantly higher than what the Allies were able to generate, and it was a tempo that they weren't able to cope with. So Major General Murray Lyon of the 11th Indian Division, he fainted from sheer physical fatigue after Jitra. The commander of 28th Brigade, Brigadier St John Carpendale, and Brigadier Garrett, they had sick leave and leave of command from exhaustion from the tempo that was being maintained as they were trying to keep their brigades alive. Now, the tempo meant that they weren't able to ever get a rest. And this did two things. One, it decreased their morale because they were continually tired. And two, it robbed them from decision superiority. So they were making poorer decisions, which meant that the operational tempo was increasing because they were continually trying to catch their tail to make up for operational mistakes, which further degraded morale. Now, after the fall of Singapore, the Japanese went one step further. They actually helped create the Indian National Army. So they took all of the prisoners that they've captured and local Indians and offered them the opportunity to fight in an Indian National Army. And this really goes to that moral dislocation. We're going to take the troops and we're going to turn them around to fight against you. Quite a powerful value proposition that was created by the way that the British had acted as colonial overlords. And I think that this is a really interesting illustration of the way that the moral aspect of the environment played into the morale of the troops. Now, let's have a look at the Japanese. And it's almost the mirror image of the Allies. So morale is high. These are troops who have been at war for years. So all of the bad leaders have been weeded out. All of the bad troops have been weeded out. They have got doctrine that is battle-hardened. It is tried and tested. It works. So you've got experienced, well-led, well-trained troops. And they viewed the British as being quite poor. They really did look down on Allied forces, and they were very keen to get to grips with them and to fight them. On top of that, what were they fighting for? So they were fighting for the emperor as the emperor sought to create the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. This is Asia for the Asiatics. We are going to throw out the oppressors, and we are going to get all of our Asian brothers and sisters together and create an alliance that is centered around the power of Japan. And that is something that they were all very, very keen on. It was built upon the Bushido Code, and that had been modified. And their education system had started social engineering students in the 20s. So these people had come up through a school system, so protection for the weak had been removed, ferocity, contempt for the foe, superiority of the Japanese warrior, and the need to expand the empire. This had been taught in school. Officers were required to take matters into their own hands if senior officers didn't undertake the imperial agenda strongly enough. Very harsh discipline for sailors and soldiers, as harsh as the discipline in the Waffen-SS. It was an identity and culture that was shared amongst the people, the government, and the armed forces, and it created a united, disciplined, and self-sacrificial armed force. Now, so you've got an education system that is working towards creating a warrior race, really reinforcing the cult of the empire and the emperor. And I can't help but ask the question of what role does the education system play in the National Strategic Plan? This was a critical requirement for the Japanese war effort. So what role did it play? What role should the education system play in a national strategic plan? It created a significant advantage for the militaristic government by having the entire population mobilized towards your way of thinking. And this is why, when the Japanese Prime Minister was assassinated by 11 junior naval officers, 350,000 people signed a petition to have them treated leniently, and they signed that petition in blood. And I find that completely amazing, because this isn't like today where you can just go to change.org and put your email address in. People had to physically sign this in blood. That's a really good illustration of just how successful this campaign was to create a very strong input for the morale of the Japanese. And the Allies would be facing this for the entirety of the war. And it's one of the reasons why the atomic bombs were dropped, was because the invasion of Japan was just going to be incredibly costly based on the number of people who were expected to pick up a weapon and defend the homeland, defend the emperor. Now, one last little thing that I want to think about with the Japanese and their morale is that Yamashita was able to take troops out of the front line and rest them. So compare and contrast the operational tempos. You've got the attacking force heavily outnumbered, lots of defending troops, and yet the defending troops aren't getting any sleep. They're continually being dislocated out of their positions, sleep deprivation, fear about being encircled, fear about having their withdrawal routes being threatened, up against troops who are able to grab 2 or 3 days out of the front line to be able to have a bit of a rest, able to get that really, really good sleep, recharge their batteries and get back into the fight and really punch on, really drive incredibly hard. And this is the thing that's amazing when you consider that he left part of his forces in Taiwan as a theatre reserve. Even having done that, he's able to rotate his troops around and make sure that they're able to get the rest that they need to be able to drive relentlessly through the Allied positions. So, there you have it. We've covered morale, I think, in some fairly good detail, and I think we've highlighted some of the important things that you need to be doing to maintain the morale of your troops. The Japanese troops were fed on a diet of victories, and that really reinforced their high morale that they had to start off with. The British, operating in a tempo which was very high, poorly trained, poorly led troops in general weren't able to sustain the morale that they had at the start of the campaign, and as it decreased, it significantly impacted their operational performance. So Now, that's the last of the principles. We're going to continue on with a look at 3 leaders who I want to really delve into the way that they led and what it was that they did in some specific actions that they were involved with. And so we'll return with Galahad and the ambush at Gamass.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.